I know it's a very deeply felt loss. So dual-use technology, the concern about it is something that dates back to the days of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and the fear that technologies that have a beneficial purpose could also be used for destructive ends. That concern continued with the era of biological weapons. Today we find ourselves in a world where almost any technology is dual use. Any technology can be used for both good and harm. And one of the, I think, signature features of the kinds of technologies we're seeing developed today, whether it's on digital technologies on the internet, whether it is genetic engineering, almost anything that you can see is not simply in the hands of a handful of governments or powerful corporations. These are increasingly democratized technologies which anybody can use. And so the potential for anybody to get their hands on something and use it for nefarious purposes is multiplying, and that creates real dilemmas for policymakers, and in particular people like Director Wray, who is sitting here with us, part of whose job at the FBI is to both promote the use of technology for economic development and make sure that it is available, whilst also thinking about the threats that it can pose and how to prevent it getting into the wrong people's hands. So some of the kinds of technologies that we see having dual use today, well, we can imagine AI tools that are being used for recognizing and preventing cyber attacks are also being used to analyze vulnerabilities in increasingly large attack surfaces and find ways that those can be penetrated. Facial recognition tools that are used by governments to protect borders can also be used for mass surveillance, or they can be used by commercial actors or hackers for scraping people's data, for phishing attacks, for finding vulnerabilities. And of course, the conversation at Davos has all been about generative AI this year. And there's been this explosion of interest in generative AI and its potential, and it can be used for automating or speeding up many tasks or adding creativity. But it is also a way of generating misinformation that can be used for influence operations or convincing fake messages for spear phishing campaigns and the like. Ukraine is a subject that we're going to talk about because, of course, we have the first Deputy Prime Minister here with us. And because the Ukraine conflict has been a kind of a laboratory for a lot of these technological questions ever since the Russian invasion. Western-supplied drones have been instrumental in helping beat back the Russian advance. And on the other hand, some of the Iranian drones that the Russians have been using against Ukraine have turned out to have off-the-shelf Western components in them. Cloudflare, Matthew Prince, the CEO of Cloudflare, is here on the panel, has been providing DDoS protection to many Ukrainian websites and critical infrastructure, and it's withdrawn much of its work in Russia, but it's raised questions of how you balance the need of providing uncensored information to people in a war situation whilst also preventing attacks on critical infrastructure. So there are many interlocking issues that come together in the Ukraine conflict, which I think are relevant to our discussion today. So I want to start off with a question to the First Deputy Prime Minister. Obviously, Western military technology has been very important to Ukraine in this conflict, but a lot of civilian technologies have played an important role too. So can you talk a bit about what some of those are that have really helped Ukraine?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for being and having the opportunity to discuss this very important topic on this panel. I would explain why it's so important for me to be here and to give us to reflect on our experience of using technologies. Is that one of the reasons why Ukrainians show the resilience, not on the only battlefield, but also in economic life, because Ukrainian economy is operating, and the core elements of Ukrainian society and the core elements of Ukrainian economy is operating. So I mean, we have banking system that operate in a proper way, post service, railways, everything that vital for a life. One of the reasons is the fact that we are using to maintain the operation technologies, and we are very proud, like a government, that we have DIA application. It's an application for Ukrainian citizen. 18 million Ukrainians register in this DIA application. This application gives us opportunity to get passport information, COVID certificates, everything that you need for a normal life, but it's become a special instrument and tool for the government to maintain some process and procedures during the wartime. For example, we have temporarily displaced people, internally and externally. All these people have and had the opportunity to be registered in DIA, and we know the exactly amount of these people, and we have provided them possibility to apply for unemployment fees during this DIA. They don't need to go directly to the unemployment center. They can make it easily just by applying to the application. Also, they are able during this wartime, and when we understand that it's huge the quantity of destroyed residential building, and we need to, like a government, to provide one of the tools. It's a mortgage program. It's also on the DIA application. So now you can get mortgage during the wartime with help of DIA application. Also, right now, you know that there are every week shelling attack on energy grid, and we need to find a way how to maintain this energy grid. And in the system, 35% of deficit exists right now, and we are like a government launch program that help citizens to exchange the old lamps for the LED lamps. That can, it might sound probably ridiculous, but it might save the working of one nuclear station. This in case if we will be able to make the exchange for 15 million LED lamps. And we also provide it through DIA application. Everything to help us to maintain the situation in the country under the war circumstances can be provided by this DIA application. And of course, before the war, civil society and constitution law always were very skeptical about using technology because of the necessity or to secure the data information. But during the wartime, it became vital instrument for us, like a government, to provide all social fees, to provide different governmental programs for Ukrainians that under the war conditions. So that's why, currently Ukraine is a playground, let's say, for where all the important questions for security, for technology and society are radically tested at. I think that we have very good experience in using, like you said, civil technologies in running the country.
Right. So I want to underline how extraordinary I think this is, that a country that is fighting for its existence is also managing to only dream of in peacetime. It's really interesting that that is able to happen. Director Ray, I want to come to you on this question that I raised earlier. As I said, Iranian Shahed drones were captured in Ukraine, dismantled, and turned out to have Western components. And this was not secret military tech. It was, off-the-shelf components that could be, used by almost anyone, anywhere. So as you think about the legal frameworks, about supply chains, about export controls maybe, as you think about how to promote the use of technology for civilian purposes, for economic development, whilst also being conscious of the risks that can happen if it gets into the wrong hands, in this extremely globalized world, how do we even think about trying to prevent that kind of use of technology in a conflict?
Well, certainly something like an Iranian-built suicide drone being used to attack innocent civilians in the Ukraine is a particularly poignant example of why export controls matter, why sanctions matter. We take very seriously our obligation to try to protect businesses and innovation from all the threats that they face, but by the same token, we do need businesses to ask responsible questions of potential customers so that they can ensure that their technology is not being used in horrific and irresponsible ways. And so I think that's where the export control regime is designed to help strike that balance to protect innovation for all the positive things that the technologies can be used for, but also to try to guard against, really in this case, catastrophic consequences.
Right, but do you see a way? Do you see this being having really an effect in a world that is so globalized? I mean, at some point, these technologies can be replicated and used everywhere?
Well, of course, it depends on the technology that we're talking about. But I think, in many cases, asking the right questions of the potential customers becomes a critical piece of it, and then enforcement where the technology is knowingly misused.
Yes. Okay, Matthew Prince, I want to come to you because obviously Cloudflare played a very important role in the Ukraine conflict. And when the war started, you came under immediate pressure from Ukraine to pull out of Russia altogether. And as I understand it, you chose to scale back operations very heavily, but you still wanted to be able to protect Russian independent media, or at least allow uncensored information to filter through to Russians. So can you talk a little bit about the trade-offs and how you thought about them?
Yeah, so if we go back to a year ago today, we were starting to see indicia coming out of the region that made us very worried that Russia was going to invade. And so we immediately reached out to authorities that we work with, got in contact with the Ukrainian government, and provided our services to protect their critical infrastructure from cyber attacks. When the invasion actually happened, we terminated any Russian government-affiliated customers from using our infrastructure. And then we worked with law enforcement and experts to say, what should we do next? And while there were some calls for us to pull out entirely, what we saw when we talked to the US government, when we talked to European governments, was that there was an important need for organizations like Navalny's group, Bellingcat, which is a Cloudflare customer, to be able to still get their message out. And they are themselves constantly under attack from Russian authorities. And so in order to protect them, we had to have some of our infrastructure still running inside of the country. And we made that determination that that was the right thing to do. Again, we don't pay taxes there anymore. We don't service any sanctioned entities, any government-affiliated entities. But there are still Russians who think that what's happening in Ukraine is what it is, which is an incredible travesty and potentially a war crime.
Yes.
And so the other thing that we've done is that we have provided our services to individual Russian households that want to bypass the censorship that Russia is imposing on the internet to be able to actually access Western media. And today we estimate that around 10% of Russian households are using Cloudflare's technology to bypass that censorship. We actually see consumption of Western media going up. And I'm hopeful, although again, it is awfully hard to overcome such an all-powerful regime in a country like Russia as Putin's. But I'm hopeful that if we do see changes inside of Russia, it will be in part because some people there are getting the truth. What's interesting, though, is while we were doing this, a lot of the protests erupted in Iran, and we've watched Iran shut down the internet. And I got a call from a senior official in the White House who said, can you do in Iran what you're doing in Russia? And I said, no. And they said, why not? And I said, because sanctions prevented us from ever putting our equipment in Iran. And so the same way that we can help the Russian people bypass censorship, we're unable to do that in Iran. And they said, what if we give you a license? And I said, it's too late, right? And so there's a trade-off here. And I think as a company, there's a law-abiding company trying to follow these policies, we are happy to comply with any sanctions regime and how this gets implemented. But we should understand that if you don't let us do something in a certain place, it might mean that after the fact, when you do need the network to be accessible, the internet to be accessible, that we can't after the fact solve that problem. And so that's a trade-off that I think we as the private industry as well as the government needs to have conversations around and needs to think about what those trade-offs are.
Yeah, Director Ray, what do you think about that trade-off?
I mean, we engage in those trade-offs every day. I mean, pretty much every technology we could talk about today, we see both great opportunity but great dangers in the wrong hands. And so the kind of trade-off that Matthew's talking about is something that is a source of constant discussion as we try to find that sweet spot between achieving the consequences for security that we all want without the unintended consequences.
Jake, I don't want to leave you out of the discussion, but I actually want to go one more twist on this particular question of these trade-offs, because in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think the moral calculus is pretty clear. Russia's the aggressor. Everyone is on the side of Ukraine. Western policy is clear. The moral imperatives are not very arguable. I can imagine all sorts of other conflicts arising between other countries where maybe some Western countries have an interest in supporting one or the other. Cloudflare has customers in both. Not only you, other Western companies as well that provide cybersecurity services find themselves in the uncomfortable position of, do I take a side? Do I take away protection services from this government's institutions or that government's institutions? Do I stay neutral? How would you imagine a situation like that between, I don't know, let's say a war between two countries in Africa where there isn't a clear foreign policy interest?
I think that we are fundamentally computer scientists, not political scientists. And so when situations like that happen, we have to reach out to the people who are the experts. And so in that particular situation, we would reach out to, we're a US-based company, so we'd reach out to the US Department of State, we'd reach out to the White House, we'd reach out to the FBI, and we'd say, we're not experts here. We need guidance, and we'll follow the guidance that you give us. That isn't a totally satisfactory answer, because again, that means that we are then very much aligned with kind of what U.S. policy looks like. But I think that's going to be where we're going to sort of start that conversation. But I think that's as there are companies like ours which are massively multinational. We have operations now and equipment running in over 120 countries worldwide. We have customers in literally every country on earth. And well, probably not literally every country on earth, since there are a few that are sanctioned. But that is something that we have to constantly struggle with. And again, we're going to take guidance from those people who are experts, like Director Ray.
Yes. All right, Jay, coming to you. So your company, Gecko Robotics, you make autonomous vehicles that can be sent into dangerous areas to check for problems. So things like nuclear power plants, look for places that need repair. So obviously there's a big application in war zones as well. And Ukrainian infrastructure has been part of the target of Russian attacks. There was a session yesterday that Palantir hosted with Mikhailo Fedorov, the Minister of Digital Transformation of Ukraine, where he talked about how the battlefield is a great place of technological innovation. And actually, Alex Karp used a memorable phrase. He said, "Productization happens on the battlefield." So, do you think of what is happening in Ukraine as a sort of accelerant of technological development? What do you see coming out of it, particularly in the area of autonomous vehicles and the kinds of things that you work on?
Yeah, I think historically that's been true. If you think about wars in the past, like World War II, acceleration in development of technology, whether it be penicillin or it be aviation, it's been an amazing accelerant to bringing new technology and trying out new technology that was before faced with a lot of inertia. And actually, our colleagues at Palantir and Enduro, and obviously Cloudflare, this is our moment. And I think it's also a moment for Silicon Valley tech companies to understand the importance of national security and working with governments to help protect Western ideals. And so for us in particular, our battlefront is the energy security infrastructure, another critical infrastructure. There's two battlefields in our opinion. There's obviously the warfighter on the front lines, and there's also over Christmas 9 million folks in Ukraine had no access to power. So what our company is focused on is how do we utilize robotics, fixed sensors, autonomous vehicles, as well as bringing that all into the fold with software to help predict when critical infrastructure will fail, when the built environment will fail, so we can make the right strategies and plans and things that we can recommend, because we've had the ability to see critical infrastructure across nations and even across in the defense sector too, what leads to failures and how to stop it from failing. These are critical pieces of data that drive artificial intelligence models to help predict and provide better decisions as it relates to national security on the energy front, and obviously we see that as well on the cyber side as well. And so it's important to remember AI models are only as good as the data inputs going in. And in the built world, we have very bad access to data. So robotics are an amazing way to safely, quickly, but also with highest fidelity capture information that can inform ways to extend the useful life of infrastructure in the Ukraine, in Europe, in America. Because you have to remember, this infrastructure that powers everything you see here in the room, 60, 70, 80 years old, built in the Cold War, beginning to fail past useful life. And we have to ensure that that infrastructure can last as we transition and also be there in times of crisis or in times of climate change as well, like we saw over Christmas in the US. And then you have to figure out how to improve it and get more out of that infrastructure so you can invest and you can deploy and make better decisions using information. And so robotics is a critical point, a part of decoding the physical world to arm governments and arm our strategies on the battlefront as well.
Right. So broadening out that infrastructure discussion, you know, Ukraine has been a kind of a Russian testing ground for cyber attacks on infrastructure since long before this war. We saw times when large parts or chunks of the Ukrainian power grid were taken out by a Russian cyber attack. And that raised concerns of the same thing happening in other countries. So given what Jake is saying about how we are learning about infrastructure vulnerability, but also about resilience and how to protect it better as a result of this war, thinking about the fact that more and more infrastructure control systems are computerized, are accessible remotely, therefore vulnerable to cyber attack, thinking about the fact that autonomous vehicles and drones of one kind or another being used in inspections or being used for monitoring create a further attack surface potentially for cybersecurity. So when you think of all of those things together, Director, does it make you feel like US infrastructure specifically, or infrastructure in general, is becoming more vulnerable or less vulnerable? Are we getting better at anticipating these threats, or are they multiplying? And how do we think about ensuring that security in the future?
Yes. I mean, I think on the one hand, the attack surface, as you say, is significantly broadening. The range of attack methods is significantly increasing, both in quantity and quality. On the other hand, I think the sophistication of the private sector is improving, and particularly important, the level of collaboration between the private sector and the government, especially the FBI, has, I think, made significant strides. We are focused, looking at cyber attacks, looking at what's happening in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We did see, as the conflict erupted, an increased effort by the Russian intelligence services, which have been conducting malicious cyber activity against U.S. infrastructure for years. But we're increasingly concerned that the surveillance activity, the scanning, the research, all the preparatory activity that could be one thing, could be an indication of something more serious. And so the name of the game in terms of cyber defense from our perspective is to try to get, to use a terrorism analogy, further left of boom. And that's why, for example, we conducted a significant technical operation against a GRU botnet in the early months of the conflict, because we didn't want to wait around to find out what they were up to and what their ultimate intentions were. You know, when you talk about autonomous vehicles, it's obviously something that we're excited about, just like everybody. But there are harms that we have to guard against that are more than just the obvious. One of them is the danger that there could be ways to confuse or distort the algorithms to cause physical harm. So I'm thinking about a story I heard not that long ago about the researchers who were able to trick a self-driving car's algorithm by essentially putting a piece of black tape over a stop sign and cause the car to accelerate by 50 miles an hour or something. You know, it's a simple example, but it shows kind of some of the harms we have to guard against. And then a different kind of harm that we're concerned about is the enormous amount of data that autonomous vehicles, for example, aggregate. And anytime you aggregate lots and lots of sensitive data, it makes a very tempting target. So thinking of electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, as an attack surface of their own, not just in terms of destructive ability, but in terms of the data that it aggregates and the harms that could come from that, is something that is very much on our mind.
Yeah.
Yes, just quickly, I think that I actually see a story of optimism around cyber and Ukraine, because as the minister talked about, Ukraine is still able to run their digital economy. They're still able to function today. And if you look at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, which did not happen in February of last year, it happened with Crimea. The cyber attacks that happened then were much more destructive and much more effective. And so I think two things have happened. The first is enormous credit has to go to the Ukrainians, where they have learned, they've become experts, they've become much better at defending their own nation in cyberspace. But credit also has to go to, selfishly Cloudflare, but Microsoft and CrowdStrike and Google and others who have stepped up and lent their technology to say, we're going to give you the best of what we can do. And what's amazing is that when you take the best and you go up against an adversary that sometimes seems almost nihilistically impossible to defeat, like the scary Russian cyber hackers, the good guys win. And that's what's happening right now. When the best of the good guys go up against the worst of the bad guys, the good guys can win in this space. And I think that is an optimistic message for us to take going forward.
Thank you. You've both given me a great segue into my next question to Yulia Sviridenko. So the question for you, First Deputy Prime Minister, is this has been an information war in many respects, right? We've seen how tracking Russian soldiers' cell phones has enabled Ukraine to target missile attacks on them. On the other hand, you also see how Russia has been using posts on social media by Ukrainian civilians to identify vulnerabilities or look at the state of readiness of Ukrainian forces. So this is a classic, I think, dual-use dilemma about the openness of a society when we have digital technology, when we have social media. So in an age when a society is very transparent, in wartime, how do you think about digital self-defense? How do you think about making the country less vulnerable to attacks that are based on the kind of information that it is naturally generating in its online life?
I think that you answer your own question, so it's a natural, and that's why we can't stop it. So that's why what we should focus on, and I absolutely agree with the panelists that we. The war that is happening in Ukraine, I think it's absolutely obvious that there's some kind of existential war. There is, for me, and I think that the whole democratic world, absolutely obvious that it's a bad guys and good guys, and there is evil, and so it's a war against the evil. So that's why what we need right now is just to provide us with the proper technologies, and what we feel, what we observe, that starting from the first day of invasion, we started the defense ourselves with the one level of technologies and using one level of weapons, and we will definitely win this war with another level of technologies, as Ukraine now is a huge battlefield, huge one, and this knowledge that we gained during this war, it's absolutely unique, and it's very useful, I think, that for the future global agenda, let's say like this. And that's why it's so useful for us that I think that the biggest and the best minds of this world will be able to provide us with the proper technology to speed up our victory. Because I think that obvious for everyone that Russia won't get what they want, but the question is, so how long it take us to get the victory? So that's why I think that technology can play a vital role in this war. And what we're trying to, facilitate from our side for these small companies, even those ones that are set up in garage during this wartime, we're trying to facilitate them to scale up, to find the finance, to set up some acceleration for them. So, and I think that it's vital things in this war. It's bridge between public and private companies, small one, big one. it helps us to win this war. So that's why what we're asking, just focus on Ukraine. Don't focus on Russia propaganda, because it's something that happened in Russia naturally, and we can't influence, we can't block it. But we can just pay our attention on Ukraine, on our integrity, on our technological level, on everything that can help us to win this war.
Yeah. So I have a related question to that. So I'm British.
Yeah.
We were brought up on myths of the Second World War, when all the Brits, put sandbags around their doors and had heavy blackout curtains so that the Nazi bombers wouldn't see from the sky, and painted over the headlights of the cars, and took down the street signs so if the Germans came, then they wouldn't know which way to turn. So this was called civil defense. Mm-hmm. And it was about educating the population in the role that it plays in national security or in defense of the country in a war. How do you think, is there something equivalent in the digital age? In Ukraine, is there civil defense in terms of making people conscious of how their activity online makes the country more vulnerable, and making them more conscious of how they can play a role in protecting it?
I see that civil defense actually related to the topic of this panel. Civil defense in Ukraine look like that fact that Ukraine donated for drones, also in the application. I will show it to you. And Ukrainian civil defense are in setting up small businesses, developing Ukrainian drones as well. As now what we're trying to do right now, drones become very vital in this war. And what we're trying to do is to simplify the import of the drones from one side, and to facilitate the production of Ukrainian drones from another side. And export control is important, I know. So we're simplifying it, but we're always, for the dual use, it's another story. So I think that civil defense in Ukraine is very, based on technologies, on digital solutions. So, and I think that majority of Ukraine, both those ones who donate on technologies and those ones who are set up small businesses and trying to develop it, are all our defense. It's a civil defense. I know Ukraine, the whole country are fighting both on the economic front, on military front, on technological fronts. The whole country is fighting. So our civil defenses look like a development of technologies, in development on military's tools that help us to protect and to defend our land.
Yes. Since we, as I said earlier, everyone here seems to be talking about AI, the rise of generative tools like ChatGPT has kind of reminded us how powerful AI is, even though a lot of the developments that we've been seeing have nothing to do with ChatGPT specifically. But it creates many opportunities, both in military and also in cybersecurity, and it raises questions of dual use in many respects. So I actually want to start with one of the examples that Director Ray brought up, this idea that autonomous vehicles, as they're roaming the world, are collecting massive amounts of data, and that could be used by adversaries to exploit all sorts of threats. So maybe I'll throw that question to you, Jake. I mean, since you are promoting and developing the use of autonomous vehicles, how do you think about the ways in which that data could be used for malicious purposes, and how we guard against that?
Yeah, well, I think cybersecurity, the push for development and the implementation of cybersecurity, not just commercially, but also with energy and utility companies, needs to be forefront and probably is not invested in heavily enough. So I think both physical and cybersecurity needs increased investment to ensure that data doesn't fall into wrong hands and manipulated in bad ways. And I think that robotics, the sexy versions of robotics that you might see in daily life, whether it be delivering packages to your doorsteps or on roads, I think that's a world of robotics.
Thank you very much.
Ja, herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren.
Mr. Secretary, dear Lloyd, welcome here in Germany in the Ministry of Defense. I'm very glad